Today on Call for Two, a spoiler-free review of Razorhurst by John Keane. What is this amazing game and where can you get your hands on it? Stay tuned to find out. So what exactly is Razorhurst? Razorhurst is a print and play narrative mystery detective game written by John Keane. It's free. You can download it from Boardgame Geek. If you do try to print it out, you're going to be stuck with a 200-page document, but it's very well suited to play directly on a tablet in PDF format. It's in the family of Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, but it's a sort of epic campaign taking place over a period of a week. Probably take you 5 or 6 game sessions of 2 to 3 hours each. It's got some hybrid elements in addition to the pure mystery deduction we're used to in Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. There are some skill tests that require the roll of a die, which we'll talk about quite a bit. It is based on a true life crime set in 1927-1928 Australian gang underworld. It's got a day and night schedule and calendar, which you can see here, that splits the case into days where events happen between days, and a very interesting fatigue management system where you can stay up late, but your skills decrease as time goes on. You can decide how late to sleep to refresh your skills, but then you run the risk of missing events. Fascinating hybrid system. We'll talk about that. It is a very epic feeling game that is paradoxically focused on a very small, sort of mundane crime. And that gives it a very unique sort of taking its time in this world. It has a very unique feel. Before I go into more detail, let me remind you that these narrative mystery games, which can only be played once, are incredibly subjective, and they're affected by your expectations. So if this sounds like something you're interested in, you might want to stop watching the review now. Keep your expectations reasonably low. It's not a perfect game. Play it and come back and watch when you're finished. But if you're curious, let's continue. Okay, a little bit about the story and atmosphere. I said already, this is based on a true crime from 1920s Australia. The designer, John Keane, goes into some detail in the beginning and in the end, talking about the true life facts of this case. Their actual dialogue taken from court records and everything, it makes the game feel different and special that you're playing in this with these real people. You can see the game has all of these mug shots of people involved in the case. These are just printed out and laminated. The mug shots are real photos from 1927 criminals and witnesses in Australia for the most part. The mug shots tell you a little bit about them, when they were born, their name, height, weight, fingerprint information. I'll return to some of the fingerprint stuff later. As far as text and writing, Nothing has surpassed the level of writing quality that we saw in Postmortem LA, but it is of very high caliber, the writing. There are real moments of humor, laugh out loud, characters you get attached to. It's all set in a fairly small neighborhood. Everything is very confined. You're encountering the same people over and over again. So it really, you feel like you know these characters and they're differentiated. You have a good feel for them. It also feels more realistic in that there aren't as many sort of cartoonish twists that you might see in a fictional mystery. But at the same time, there's some real enjoyment in doing sort of procedural police work, just sort of the nuts and bolts, shoe leather work of talking to witnesses. And as you would expect in a real world case, the witnesses don't always agree. There are inconsistencies. There are things that never get resolved, just as you might expect in a real world case. There are also some clever little twists on the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective system. There aren't printed newspapers here, but as I said, the game is broken up into a week's worth of game days, and it will test your stamina to play this campaign. You'll probably have a almost impossible task of trying to play it in one session, so you should expect to play multiple sessions, and your stamina will get tested. But so instead of having a printed newspaper that you read, every day of this case that goes by, there's sort of a night set of events and morning set of events. And one of the morning sets of events is you're reading a little bit of a newspaper. It's just very cleverly broken up into chunks with different little mechanics. And as I said, the parallels to Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, to see how things are the same and how things are different, is quite fascinating from a game design perspective, if that's something you're interested in. One of the things that a lot of these mystery narrative detective games have tried to dip their toe into, experiment with, is the idea of a clock, of time going by in the world, limiting the players to a specific amount of time to add some tension and some make decisions feel a little weighty. But it's never really satisfying. Gumshoe, 1986 game that was created by the same people who made Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, tried hard to do a time system. More recent games, Bureau of Investigation and Mythos Tales, both use a sort of a limited time amount available for each day, and Mythos Tales has a day-night schedule. I would say Razorhurst, from my standpoint, has the most successful day-night time clock system of any of these games that I've played. And it's a very clever system. And if we look at it, we can see you've got this chart that you can use to track your progress. You can see the campaign starts on Wednesday and lasts through Tuesday. Most actions you take will take up one click of the clock. Some might take none, some might take more. And there are fascinating things that are occurring. First of all, you're reading a story event at the start of each day and at the end of each day, which mean there are events that are happening that are scheduled at certain times and on certain days, and things that happen as the campaign goes along. You might learn about an event a couple days in the future. You'll write it in, you'll schedule it. You'll have to make sure to get back there. Traveling in this world takes a little bit of time, so you'll have to plan on that. And then there's this whole fascinating thing. There's a day and night schedule. Certain places may only be available at night or during the day, or might change what you read if you go there at night or day. But there's this fascinating thing where over time, you've got these skills. You've got observation, persuasion, and physical fight. And from these 3 skills, as the day goes on, you drop in your rating for this skill. That means early in the morning you're strongest, and you probably want to be smart about going to places that have high skill tests. And then in the evening, and remember there's certain places you can only go during the evening, but in the evening, all through the day, you're getting fatigued in these skills, so the skills drop down. We'll talk about how you use those skills. But then you've got a tough decision about when to go to sleep. As soon as you go to sleep, you start recovering your skills, depending on when you wake up. So while you're playing, there's this careful balance of, well, I want to stay late so I can go to these places at night, and so that I get this done before this event the next day, but my skills are decreasing, which means if I have to do any tests, I'm going to perform worse. But if I stay up too late, I'm going to have to sleep in the morning of the next day. And remember, you don't know till you wake up and read what has happened. So you've got this palpable fear of, if I sleep too late, am I going to miss some event? Is some event going to come up that I slept through? And there's some real risks of that. Now, whether that's always going to work for you, for your group, whether it is going to add some real tension and stress and paranoia, whether you might get unlucky there, we'll return to that later. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this skill test system, which, if you're a fan of Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, you may very well have the same reaction I had, which is, no thank you. We don't want rolling of dice and skill tests in our narrative mystery detective games. But here's an area that was a complete surprise to me. It was a surprise to me how much I enjoyed it and how well it worked. Now let's start out with the foundational motivation for doing these kinds of skill tests. Many designers who work in this genre of these mystery games, deduction games, have tried to add some kind of gaminess to them, so it doesn't feel like you're just sitting there and there's no tension about where to go, what leads to read. You're just completely relaxed. You know you have all the time in the world. You can read anything in any order, so it doesn't really matter what you do in what order. Eventually you're going to go do everything, see everything. There's no stress, there's no tension. So the idea of trying to add some drama and strategic decision-making to these games is a theme we see constantly, and it's never really successful. But this is as close as I've seen to being successful. So let's take a look at it. When you pick, in this game, you pick one of these detectives to play as. These were real detectives. You can play the first female detective in Australia. And when you pick one of these detectives to play over the course of the campaign, they have different stats in these 3 areas, in observation, persuasion, and force. And I would recommend you take the balanced detective who's got equal numbers of all of these skills. We'll return to that in a second. The point is, you start off the campaign at the highest level of skill in each area, observation, persuasion, and force. And when you come to a test, most of the tests will have fairly low requirements, like you have to roll a 5, you have to get a 5 or more to pass the test. So you roll the die and you add the value you roll to your current skill level. So basically when you're at a 6, you're going to be passing every test you might take. But as time goes by, each time goes by, you drop that skill level. So after 6 a.m. you would drop your persuasion skill level by 1. So halfway through the day, you're down at level 3 on all of your tests, and the die rolls are quite precarious. Now, there are a couple of things you can do to mitigate these skill tests. First of all, if you get equal to the test level threshold you're trying to pass, you can re-roll for free. Or at any point, you can spend skill levels on a different skill to bump up your value. So if you really felt like you really wanted to pass this test and you were off by 3, you could actually drop your persuasion by 2 and your force by 1 to bump up your observation by 3. You can do that after you roll and then pass the test. So there's lots of ways to mitigate tests. You can go back and retake tests if you fail. And then the author has been tweaking house rules and modifications to give you some free rerolls, stuff like that. So it doesn't feel quite as punishing as we've seen in some other games. There's very few cases where you can't get yourself to pass the test if you really think it's important or come back. It just may mean coming back when you're fresher on the next day or going to sleep early because you've used up all your skills, you've spent them to pass the test. So it's got the positive elements of tension and stress and causing you to worry about wasting time, because remember, every time you waste, your skills start dropping, and they drop asymmetrically, so it makes you start thinking about, well, my force is going to drop very early in the day. Maybe I should try to go do this sooner. So it puts all of that stuff in your head that you want, tension and chewing over decisions and optimization, while at the same time not making it a super punishing system. You don't feel terrible about bad rolls often, although we can get into whether it's possible to have a bad time with that. There's some more optimization stuff going on here too. The map is a fascinating system, although I do have some complaints about it. But essentially, instead of the Sherlock Holmes giant map of locations, most of which are decoys, here we have a much more compact map broken up into neighborhoods with just a few locations in each neighborhood. And there's a little bit of an efficiency system here in that traveling from one neighborhood to another costs a click of your time, whereas going to places staying within a neighborhood doesn't. So it creates a little optimization puzzle there where you're trying to figure out, well, where should we go? We can do both of these things here. Let's wait to go here until we've got more to do. Very clever. And remember, traveling is dropping your skills and causing fatigue, and the end of day events might take up time that you're not quite sure about. So there's always enough uncertainty of what you're going to need and encounter that you're constantly worrying about spending your time efficiently. And all of these rules, the traveling, the skill tests, and when you need a certain skill test to do a certain thing, all feel reasonably thematic and sensible. If you play something like Detective Modern Crime, they've got these use of tokens, and sometimes you're like, why does it use that token? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel thematic. Why would I need a token for this? But here, the skill tests seem reasonable. They're not all over the place. They're sprinkled here and there, and they feel like they fit in with the story. And the thing with the fatigue dropping your skills here, it's all transparent. You can see, well, if we go to sleep now and we sleep till then, here's where we'll be maxed out at our skill levels. And so it's transparent in terms of managing your skills. You can do good planning to be fully refreshed. But it's also got that push your luck element that is exactly what you want in these kinds of cooperative games, where if you try to completely eliminate risk, you're going to have to make very poor, suboptimal decisions. You cannot reduce your risk to zero. So that creates this delicious element where you're like, well, we'll wake up, we'll be a little tired, but we'll push our luck by waking up a couple hours later. You're always balancing these things and never completely eliminating risk. And that's a good feeling. Okay, let's talk about the mystery elements, the end game solution, etc. First of all, before you get to the end, there's a very clever, unique, strategic, thematic, narratively built in-game hint system here. Maybe I'm overselling it a little bit. But if you think about Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective having these allies you can go visit in each case, and they sort of act as a kind of hint system. Well, here we've got a much more clever system that involves some gamey strategic decisions. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it's very clever. It fits in with the game and it gives you some tough choices about what areas you need help with. John Keene, who's developed this, has actually said that he's not played Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, and that's quite, I think, adds to some of the sort of what we see here is alternate reality solutions to some of these things, most of which are actually improvements over Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective System. Not all, but we'll get back to that. But one thing that's really wonderful here is how the end game unfolds when you're asked questions. It's not the simple standard Sherlock Holmes, here are your 5 questions. It's much more of an interactive narrative unfolding of the end of the case, where stories interleaved with questions. It's a much more sort of satisfying way of scoring. You're asked basically about a question, and then the game explains it fully to you, the background, and then it asks you sort of on the honor system for this question, give yourself 0 to 3 points based on how well you understood it. And you're asked like 10 questions. It's very satisfying. It's exactly the way this should be done. Normally when we play these games, sometimes it's like asks you a question in a game and then it says that's worth 5 points, and we sort of have to house rule it and be like, well, we got it mostly correct, so we're going to give ourselves 4 points. This game just embraces that. It says, here's the thing, here's what happened, how well did you understand it, give yourself some points in this range. And it's got some clever ways. It gives you different points for different things, awards you points for having skills left over, and all weaves it into a story. Beautifully done. There's lots of room while you're playing this long epic campaign, which you can watch our live stream playthrough. I think it took us about 24 hours, 25 hours to play the entire campaign. But there were several times during this campaign, at least once per session, where we really stopped and chewed over ideas. And I think you're well advised in all of these kinds of games to pause at certain points, recap your theories of the case, try to anticipate what's happening, try to figure things out early. This game rewards it. This game also really rewards you for taking detailed notes, which is, for me, a huge part of these games. And I want these games to reward me for being a good detective and keeping detailed notes and being able to reference those notes and go back to them. This game really does do that well, and it makes you feel like you're a detective. One of the things we talk about when we review these games is that these are narrative storytelling games, that they're for readers who enjoy reading. And it's sometimes very disappointing to get to the end of these games and see like a couple paragraph solution. Well, here we've got sort of double epilogue. We've got a wrap-up story, and then we've got a nice lengthy epilogue. And then we've got designer notes from John Keene about the creation of the game and the real-life history of the game. It's a pleasure for a reader, from a reader standpoint, it's a pleasure to experience. Now, and then the punchline to all of this is that John Keene developed this game over the period of just 4 or 5 months. And if there's any justice in this world, this game will get the recognition it deserves, and maybe John Keene will consider making another case for us. It's clear that this system was intended to support multiple cases. And we're going to take a look inside at the rule book and some extra documents to give you some feel for the framework next. Okay, let's open it up and take a look at some of the starting document. I'm not going to show you any of the clues. You can see most of what I've printed out here are clues. Again, you should play this probably on a tablet where you can, everything is hyperlinked. So it's not just a raw PDF, it's a PDF designed to help you play it with a PDF reader, and so you can jump around. There's lots of sort of branching points where you'll read a paragraph and it'll say, if you want to do this, go read this. If you want to do this, go read this. And you can just click those to go. So I'm not going to show you any of those. A lot of these pages are very brief and half length. So don't think that these are full 8.5 by 11 full of text. They're not, but there is a lot of writing in this game. Okay, let's look at the rule book and mention a couple things. So set in Australia, it's a true story. The rules are here about printing these out. Tells you how to use the calendar time system. The game actually, you could jump right in and it basically explains it as you go. Tells you how you can mitigate your skill test rules and time passing. This is all stuff we've talked about. There is a little bit of system of gating. Occasionally you're told to circle a letter when you've gained certain knowledge or experienced something. And then when you get to a different paragraph, it might say, hey, if you have B, then read this paragraph. If you have F circled, then you can do this. If you don't, you should leave, etc. We've seen this in Dave Neal's Baker Street Irregulars box and other Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective Systems. But here it is. It's all nicely laid out on this page for you. Very useful document. Tells you how you have to end your day. There's no death or anything like that. Now, let me show you this little supplementary document here. Forensic methods. Now, you're either going to be the person that sees this and gets super excited, or you're going to be the person who sees this and says, this is not the game for me. So maybe this is a point to take a look at, see if this appeals to you. First, there's a little section on ballistics, different guns, what caliber they fire, how many shots they hold. This is from a real book, Pistol and Revolver Shooting from 1922. So you've got a couple pages on that, revolvers, pistols, etc. Then there's a section on fingerprint classification, how it works, how the system works, how to get fingerprints. 3 pages on that. All of the mug shots have a little bit of information about the person's fingerprints if they're known. They're all the mug shots are named, so the game will occasionally introduce you to someone and you'll just go and find their mugshot. It just gives you a face picture to put to the face to put to the name, and their stats on the back. Then there's a little section on 1902 statistics on how foot length correlates with height, boots versus bare feet. So there you go. Now, you have to ask yourself, does that appeal to you or not as a detective? Do you like that kind of detail? Now, in fairness, that is more of a promise of this system than actually used in this campaign case. Those things that I just showed you in the forensic documents are not used very much. They're sort of teased. They're used a little bit. But clearly the idea was to use this in a broader set of cases. But absolutely fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about some of the weaker areas of the game. For me, the weakest area of the game, by far, is the map system. If you're used to Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective or Gumshoe or Postmortem LA, one of the joys of playing these games is having this big map on your table that really conveys a sense of place. You can see how far away different places are. So in addition, and then, so it's got this atmospheric purpose and this purpose of making it feel more real to you, like this is a real place with real topography and this is near this and far away from this. But in addition to that atmospheric role, these games tend to make use of a map as a fairly substantial element in figuring out mysteries, because typically in Sherlock Holmes and in Postmortem LA, those kinds of games, Gumshoe, you've got a map which is populated by hundreds of locations. Most of them are not going to be relevant to your case, but you don't know which ones are. And then there'll be a directory where you can look up people by name, and yellow pages where you can look up businesses by type. And again, the overwhelming majority of these locations are not useful to you and don't have relevant entries in the clue book, but you don't know which ones. And that mystery element of trying to figure out where to go to get information and trying to remember, oh, we've run into someone, maybe we can figure out their full name, and if we can figure out their full name, we can look them up in the white pages, and if we can look them up and find them in the white pages, then we can go visit them. Or this person was killed by poison, so where would you get poison? Maybe at a drugstore, so let me visit the drugstores in the neighborhood, and that maybe will track me to my culprit. Or, this is too far for them to have walked, so they must have taken a cab or a bus, so let me visit the cab stations to see if anyone remembers them. That entire kind of mystery deduction, figuring things out, is absent from this game. There's just a handful of locations, and everything is out here. You can go to every place, and you don't have to worry about, are we forgetting to check something? And that's a huge part of these other games, and a real challenging part of these other games. So that's missing here. The mystery, deductive element, and also the sense of place. Another area that I felt was a miss was in choosing your detective here. It's a fun idea, thematically, to be able to choose a different detective to play. However, one of the things that happens when the writer of these games lets you choose what character to play and where to go in, is that the writer then can't say anything about your character, your player interacting with people, because the writer doesn't know. Have you picked a woman? Have you picked a man? Have you picked someone who likes fighting? Whatever. So it's giving up some control on behalf of the writer means they can't put as much flavor and put your character into the role as much. But there's also this element where each of these characters has different max skills. And I think that's probably a mistake. Other people who've played this game on BGG have reported that they really regretted picking one of these characters that has low skills for low values for some of their skills and high values for another, because in general the game is balanced to use all of these skills fairly evenly, and you don't have a choice. You're never at a place where it says, hey, if you want to use force, do this, and if you want to use observation, you can do this, and then you could just say, well, I'm going to play my character. If my character is heavy in observation, that's the choice I'll make when I have a choice. You don't really have those choices. You just stumble into a location, you need a certain skill, and you feel bad when you don't have that skill. So probably my recommendation and advice would be to take Leonard Almond, who's got an even distribution of all his skills. So to me, that was slightly a miss to have different characters with different skill levels. I've talked about it, the fact that the forensic document with fingerprints and shoe sizes and ballistics was very exciting to me, and it was a little bit of a disappointment that it played so little of a role in this case. I'd like to see more of that. If you love the idea of fingerprint matching, you definitely should check out the 1986 Gumshoe game, which makes heavy use of fingerprinting. I've also mentioned that there's a little bit of a feeling that I wish there were more twists and turns in the case, more the stuff that you would put in if you were writing fiction. This is sort of the old phrase that truth is stranger than fiction. Well, it's not really the case here, and it's probably not the case most of the time. This is a fairly small crime, and that has pros and cons. It does feel real, and you really can sink your teeth into it. But maybe if you weren't locked into making it a true story, you might play around a little bit more and have a little more interesting twists. And maybe the last thing I'll say is that perhaps it leaned a little too heavily on a sort of choose your adventure style choices, where we get to a place and it says, if you want to do this, go here. If you want to do this, go here, rather than it being sort of pure deduction. Although there are also an occasional puzzle that you have to solve, there's lots of variety and different kinds of things being tried. But for my money, I'd like to see more pure deduction and less random rolling. Who's going to enjoy this game the most? I do think that if you've got a special place in your heart for true crime and historic crime, 1920s Australia, an unusual setting, then this is really going to be a special experience for you. There are very few options for that kind of experience in this genre. It's also going to be for people who love note-taking, sort of just procedural work, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, getting all your ducks in line, dealing with conflicting witness statements, and just putting together what feels like a real world set of facts, scope, and contradictions and discrepancies and missing elements. A feeling of a real case. It's also going to be fascinating for those who are interested in the game design issues in this genre. There are some new ideas here, and some of them are done surprisingly well. I also think this is going to appeal to people who like being challenged in their stamina, who are completionists, who want to read everything, go everywhere, have enough time to exhaustively think about everything, and want to take their time and enjoy the process and the reading of everything. And who might be maybe underwhelmed, disappointed by this. I think if you're really committed to pure deduction, logic, solving a mystery, and are really opposed to the idea of skill tests and dice rolling, then some of this might rub you the wrong way. If you don't like the sort of micromanagement of when should we go to sleep to maximize our skills and eliminate fatigue, if you don't like that kind of stuff, then this game might rub you the wrong way. And if you don't have some patience for working around skill tests that you might fail, I do think there are ways to mitigate those tests and come back and sleep. But if you're just frustrated by that kind of thing, and if you're easily frustrated, you could get unlucky and have a bad experience. Even if you do generally like that stuff, there's a chance that you'll get some bad rolls. And a good solution to that would be some house rules to make those tests easier. We used a house rule where we allowed ourselves one free reroll. The designer John Keane has tweaked the rules to give you some free rerolls. But I would advise you, if that's a sore spot for you, maybe feel free to do some house ruling on that. It's not critical. You do want to keep some of the tension, but I think you should adjust it to ameliorate any problems you have with that. And lastly, this is probably not for you if the idea of playing 15 hours of a game, of thinking about a single case, is not appealing, and keeping notes is not appealing. If that just feels like you don't have time for it or stamina, it's exhausting, then maybe this isn't for you. Okay, to summarize, this is a unique historical true crime experience, and absolutely in the top tier of these kinds of mystery narrative Sherlock Holmes consulting detective like games. There are very few other options if you want this kind of true crime experience. But if you are interested, you might check out the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective Jack the Ripper cases, the big red box set. Those I felt were artistically fascinating, but failed for me from a game perspective. But it is interesting to see how that treats the true crime mystery. I mentioned a couple other games you might check out. Gumshoe, which is a even longer, more epic game set in 1930s Los Angeles, and it leans hard into the forensic stuff, ballistics and fingerprints, etc. So if that stuff appeals to you, Gumshoe is a very special experience. If you love the high quality writing here, you could check out the Postmortem LA series. Every game I've mentioned so far, other than the Jack the Ripper cases, you can watch playthroughs and reviews on this channel. But the Postmortem LA has the absolute best novel quality writing of all these series. So if that appeals to you, you could try that. And if you like this epic experience of spending 15 hours in one small case, you might check out the older Sherlock Holmes consulting detective expansions like Adventures by Gaslight, Queen's Park. Those are, again, small cases that really take their time to explore. But really a special game. I don't want to set your expectations too high, but the idea, this is every bit as good as the best games for sale. And the fact that you can get this, play it, it's free, it's well suited to play online with a friend. You can both download the PDFs and play it and talk over Zoom. Really quite special. For me, this is a 10. One of my favorite experiences on the channel playing it. And if you do choose to play it, I'd love to hear how you like it. And let John Keane know on the Board Game Geek forum. He's very responsive. He loves to hear about people's experience with the game. So let us know how you like it. And I'll see you next time.